She looked me straight in the eye and said, "This meeting is for heirs only, you understand." The whole room went quiet. Not even Harold the lawyer, who'd known my family for 20 years, dared to speak. I didn't flinch. Instead, I set my leather folder down on the mahogany table, slowly opened it. 12 property deeds, all signed, notarized, and already filed with the county office. Every major asset my father ever built, now legally mine. Elaine's perfume hit me before her words did. Chanel No. 5, too sweet and too strong, like she wanted the whole room to choke on it. "What is this?" she snapped. I looked at her dead center. "You mean the properties you plan to sell next week?" I could hear Brittany suck in her breath. Miles swore under his breath. And for the first time in 5 years, I spoke as Richard Calder's daughter, not the forgotten one. Not the outsider, the heir. Funny how paper can silence a room full of people who once erased you. Would you fight back or let them write you out? Where are you listening from tonight? Have you ever been pushed out of your own family's legacy? The first thing I noticed was the doormat. It used to say, "The Whitmores." Now it just said, "Welcome." A word that sounded polite but meant nothing. Elaine had stripped the house of everything that once made it ours. And I mean ours, mine and my father's. This place used to smell like cedarwood and fresh coffee. Now it smelled like lemon disinfectant and an expensive candle trying too hard. I ran my hand along the banister. The oak had been painted white. Of course it had. She never liked anything old. Brittany appeared in the hallway barefoot in linen pants and a pale blue blouse, perfectly unbothered. "I didn't know you were coming," she said. I didn't bother correcting her. She knew, they all knew. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not after leaving, not after choosing to walk away from the family business, the family dinners, the family lies. "I was invited," I said. She raised one eyebrow but said nothing else. Just turned toward the guest room and gestured with her wine glass. "You'll be in here." I stepped in. It used to be my room. Now it was a holding space. A cold, neutral box that felt like a hotel you don't want to stay in more than one night. All my childhood books were gone. No desk, no art on the walls. The closet smelled like lavender sachets and winter coats that weren't mine. But the bedspread stopped me. Navy cotton cream embroidery. My mother made it before she got sick. She stitched every corner by hand, humming Patsy Cline in the kitchen while I did my homework on the floor. I sat down slowly, ran my fingers across the hem. A single thing they hadn't erased. Yet. I closed the door behind me and stood in the middle of the room. It wasn't large, never had been, but it used to feel like mine. Now it felt like a guest suite in someone else's home. Beige curtains, a white dresser I didn't recognize. The faint scent of dryer sheets clinging to linens that hadn't been touched in months. No pictures, no books. No sign that I had ever grown up here. The only window faced the backyard. I could see the new patio lights Elaine had installed, tiny bulbs shaped like stars strung in symmetrical rows. Cold, precise, like everything else she touched. I remembered when that yard was wild. When Dad and I built a crooked treehouse and called it base camp. We used leftover lumber from a project downtown. He let me design it even though I was only 10. Back then, I thought he believed in me. Now I wasn't sure. I walked to the closet. Still smelled like wood polish and old winters. I found a pair of golf shoes that weren't his size, a hat that said, "Blackwell Group Real Estate, not our company." They weren't just trying to erase me. They were trying to replace him too. I sat back on the bed, trying to slow my breathing. And that's when I noticed the corner of the floorboard second from the left. It was lifted slightly as if time itself had loosened it for me. I slipped off my shoes, kneeled down, gently pried it open, and there it was. The brass key, same as always, same slight bend near the teeth, same worn ribbon tied around the end frayed from the years I'd held it as a girl. It opened his office, the one they now kept locked. I didn't use it. Not yet. because something told me I wouldn't need to break anything open, not this time. They'd left too many things behind. Small things, quiet things, but sometimes that's all you need. The dining table was set for 6. Crystal glasses, polished silver, white napkins folded with military precision. But there was no seat prepared for me, not until I pulled out a chair for myself. Elaine didn't flinch. She continued speaking to the couple on her left, laughing softly, as if I were just a guest someone forgot to disinvite. There was no photograph of my father at the table, no candle in his memory, no moment of silence. Only wine, and salmon with some citrus glaze I was certain he'd have hated. He preferred fried catfish, always said fancy food tasted like disappointment with a price tag. I wondered if they'd already started rewriting his preferences alongside his will. Elaine raised her glass halfway through the meal. To Richard, she said, a visionary man, and a generous one. The words sat in the air like perfume, pleasant but designed to linger too long. I kept my hands in my lap, tightened my grip on the cloth napkin. It smelled like starch and roses. That's when she said it. We'll be handling the estate through Harold Stevenson's office next week. He's invited all relevant family members to a private reading. Relevant. Brittany glanced at me but said nothing. Miles was too busy pouring himself more wine. My fork tapped the plate by accident. A small sound, but it echoed. Elaine didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't family, not in her eyes, not in this house, not in the legacy she thought she now owned. But that was her mistake. She'd forgotten what my father used to say when someone underestimated him. Silence isn't weakness, it's a warning. I smiled, not out of spite, but because I knew something they didn't. My name may have been missing from the will, but it was already written somewhere much harder to erase. The church was packed. Men in suits, women in dark heels. The smell of perfume and polished wood filled the aisle like a lie no one dared question. I stood in the very back row. No one had saved me a seat. Elaine arrived 15 minutes early, Brittany at her side dabbing the corner of her eye without smudging her mascara. Miles looked bored before the service even began. The casket was closed. My father hated being looked at in death. He used to joke, I'll be the one person who finally gets privacy. I reached for the folded funeral program on the rack behind the pew. Heavy cardstock, gold script. In loving memory of Richard Lewis Whitmore. Below his name, a list of family members. Elaine, loving wife. Brittany and Miles, devoted children. No mention of me, not even a line. I turned the page. The floral arrangements were credited to Brittany's boutique contact. White lilies. He hated lilies, said they smelled like endings. I closed the program quietly, swallowed my anger, and sat down. This wasn't my moment, not yet, but I felt the heat crawling up my neck anyway. 60% of the initial capital that built Whitmore Real Assets had come from a land deal I closed at 28. I gave up promotions, worked weekends, pitched in the first seed money that allowed us to expand beyond Charleston. And now I was erased like a typo, like I'd never belonged at all. After the service, people lined up to hug Elaine, offer condolences, praise her for holding everything together. I stood near the exit. No one noticed, except one man, Mr. Langston, my father's former accountant. He offered me a soft nod, then slipped a folded sheet of paper into my palm before moving on. I waited until I got to my car, unfolded it slowly. It was a printed copy of the obituary that had run in the local paper, and the version he handed me included something the church program didn't. At the bottom, faint and italicized, survived also by his daughter, Vivian Calder of Atlanta. They cut me from the printed version handed out in church. But someone somewhere remembered the truth. The reception was held at the Whitmore house. Same porch, same brick path, different energy entirely. Elaine greeted guests like a hostess, not a widow. Brittany made rounds with wine glasses, whispering names I hadn't heard in years, selective memory at its finest. I hovered by the hallway near the French doors. People passed me without pause. A few nodded politely, but most didn't acknowledge me at all. It was as if I were a distant cousin no one had bothered to claim. I noticed the display table near the fireplace. Framed photos arranged in neat rows, Dad at ribbon cuttings, Dad with the mayor, Dad with Brittany at a fundraiser, Dad and Miles holding a blueprint neither of them had actually drawn. No photo of me, not even the one we took the year we opened the downtown complex, the one the paper ran on the front page. I'd been holding the scissors. He'd had his arm around my shoulder. I looked around. The air conditioning hummed louder than the conversation. Or maybe it was just my ears filtering out everything that didn't matter. I headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I heard them. Brittany and Miles by the back stairs speaking in low voices. She was half laughing, half whispering. Lawrence said he can move fast. We close Rivergreen by the end of next month, and the rest falls in line. My feet froze. Rivergreen. That land was never meant for resale. Dad and I had drawn the initial zoning layout ourselves. He called it the retirement project with a soul. Mixed income housing, public green space, local vendors, legacy. But she said it so casually, like it was just a transaction, a line item on some future portfolio. Miles snorted. She's probably going to contest it. She doesn't even know, Brittany replied. Trust me, Mom made sure of that. I stepped back, careful, quiet. The glass trembled in my hand. That land was his promise, his vision. And now it was a bargaining chip in a deal I wasn't meant to hear. I walked outside. Down the path that curved past the hydrangeas. My mother planted those. Elaine tried to cut them once, but they grew back twice as wide the next year. Maybe some things know how to survive anyway. I sat alone on the back steps. The heels of my shoes dug into the old brick. Even after all these years, I remembered where each one was cracked. I used to ride my bike up and down this path before school. Dad called it the runway. Now no one called me anything. The sky had begun to shift pale orange, settling into a softer blue. It was the time of day he always took his calls outside, walking in circles by the willow tree, murmuring ideas to himself about community space and equity and how not everything had to be luxury. He would have hated the way this felt now. Cold, polished, fake. The porch lights flicked on automatically, motion sensors, another one of Elaine's touches. She hated things that stayed on too long, said it made a house feel needy. I reached into my purse and pulled out the obituary from Mr. Langston, ran my thumb over my name like it might disappear. But it didn't, because someone still knew, still remembered. Vivian Calder, daughter of Richard Lewis Whitmore, of Atlanta, of everywhere he once imagined I'd go. I folded the paper again, slipped it back inside my bag, let my hand linger on the clasp, the same one Dad gave me on my first day as lead architect. Carrying the future, he joked. He always said legacy had nothing to do with last names and everything to do with who showed up when it mattered. I stood up slowly, brushed the dust from the back of my dress, walked to my car without looking back. They could keep their carefully scripted version of him, their lilies and linen and lipstick smiles. I had the key, the letter, the truth, and now I had a reason. If your name was written out of your own bloodline, would you stay silent or rewrite the record? The light in the storage shed flickered twice before settling into a dull yellow. The place smelled like cardboard and pine cleaner. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, each labeled in Elaine's cursive. Seasonal decor office files. Richard's books, donate later. I wasn't supposed to be here. The door had been left ajar after the reception, and curiosity had pulled me in like gravity. Or maybe something else had. A thread, a whisper, a hunch I couldn't shake. The back of the shed was packed tight, but I saw it. Tucked between a roll of rugs and a broken lamp, framed in worn wood, my mother's painting. It was the magnolia branches she used to watch from our bedroom window. She painted them every spring, always from the same spot, never finishing the sky. I pulled it out carefully, brushing the dust from the canvas. She had signed it in the corner. LMC 1989. I turned it over. My hands already knew what to look for. A thin piece of tape, almost invisible against the backing. I peeled it back with slow fingers. Behind it, tucked in a plastic sleeve, was a brass key. It looked like nothing, but it opened everything. Brrr. 15 minutes later, I stood in front of my father's study. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. The key fit cleanly. The lock gave way with a soft click. No protest. The room had been stripped. Books gone, photos gone. Even the old desk lamp with the green shade was missing. But I knew my father. He never hid things in drawers. He believed people would look there first. Instead, I checked the false panel beneath the built-in shelf. The one he used to say wasn't up to code. I pried it open with a letter opener from my bag. Inside was a small fireproof pouch, labeled in sharp black ink, VC, my initials. Inside the pouch were 3 items: a folded handwritten letter, a thumb drive, and a printed trust agreement. At the top of the document, in bold, Calder Revocable Trust. Dated 3 years ago, signed and notarized. My father's name, my name. Everything that mattered: the river Greenland, the downtown properties, even the commercial leases he once said he'd never sell. All listed. All legally transferred to the trust, and I was the sole trustee. I sat down on the floor of the study, cross-legged, back against the wall, the pouch open in front of me like some kind of quiet inheritance. I unfolded the letter carefully. The paper was thick, cream-colored. His handwriting, always precise, curved neatly across the page. Vivian, if you're reading this, then they've likely done what I feared. Don't be angry. I let too much slide for too long. I told myself it was for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence is only a delay of war. My breath caught. I hadn't realized I'd been holding it. I never stopped believing in you. And I never forgot how this all began. You at age 28, closing the first deal that changed everything. Elaine never understood what you and I were building. She saw the empire, not the foundation. When things started slipping, my health, my voice, I knew I had to act. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how much time I had to explain. And part of me was ashamed that I let them come between us. My hands didn't shake, not even a little, but I could feel my throat tightening like a rope being pulled slow and steady. The Calder Revocable Trust protects everything I built with you, not for them, not for show. For the people who still believe legacy is about place, not profit. For you. I know what they're planning. I saw the emails. Brittany and Miles aren't developers. They're brokers in tailored clothes. Let them think they've won. You have the real documents. And if you're reading this, then the timing is yours to decide. At the bottom, a simple signature: Dad. No flourish, no instructions, just his name and trust. That was all. I folded the letter back slowly, placed it on the ground beside me. Then I pulled out the trust documents again, skimmed through the sections, each one airtight. The name of the legal firm, the date of filing, the witness signatures. He hadn't just signed over the properties. He'd planned the taxes, the protections, the fallback structures. This wasn't a last-minute act of desperation. It was strategy. My father hadn't lost control. He'd waited for the moment when control would matter most. I opened my notebook. Same one I'd used when I launched my firm in Atlanta. Leather-bound, worn along the edges, pages filled with half-sketched buildings and long-forgotten deadlines. I turned to a fresh page, clicked my pen, and started writing, not emotionally, not impulsively, just facts. Item 1. Calder Revocable Trust, enacted 3 years ago. Assets. Rivergreen downtown blocks. Retail leases. 3 apartment complexes. Status active. Transferred. Final. Item 2. Elaine unaware. Item 3. Brittany planning Rivergreen sale. Item 4 leverage exists. Item 5 timing is mine. I paused. The quiet of the study felt sharper now, not empty, charged. Like a storm hadn't started yet, but the air had already shifted. I looked up at the shelves bare now, except for the shadow of dust, where his books had sat. The outlines of each volume still visible, like ghosts refusing to leave. A breeze stirred through the cracked window. It carried the faint scent of magnolia from the back garden. My mother's tree, still standing. That was legacy. Not the false mourning happening upstairs. Not the glass of wine Brittany raised like a trophy. Not the checklist Elaine kept in her phone. Legacy was something planted long ago and left to those who knew how to keep it alive. I packed the pouch, slipped the key back in my pocket, took one last look at the room. He'd written me out of the ceremony, but he'd written me into the truth. And when the time was right, I'd speak, but not yet. Let them keep their illusions a little longer. Let them keep the lilies. Let them keep their hands on a house that no longer belonged to them. I walked out of the study without closing the door behind me, left it open like a wound or a warning. Sylvia always knew where to find me. She didn't call, she didn't knock. She just appeared that morning at the cafe on Market Street, carrying her canvas tote, wearing her usual linen scarf, and holding 2 cups of black coffee like nothing in the world had changed. I figured you'd be somewhere near caffeine and resentment, she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Her voice was soft, unbothered, like someone who had seen too much to ever be surprised again. I smiled despite myself. I didn't realize I was that predictable. She shrugged. You're not, but your silence is. We sat in that pause. Let the sounds of Charleston fill the gap, horns in the distance, plates clinking, seagulls overhead. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a file folder, plain, unlabeled. I took it carefully. Inside, a printed copy of a contract. A draft sale agreement for Rivergreen. The signatures hadn't been added yet, but the intent was loud enough to fill the room. On top of that was a zoning map. The original layout had been marked through in red pen. Green space removed. Mixed income units replaced with luxury condos. Brittany's name in the corner. It was in the copier tray at the office, Sylvia said, stirring her coffee. They think nobody notices what they print when the receptionist's on lunch break. I looked at the map again, my father's sketches erased, his intentions paved over. Beneath it all, folded neatly, was a small voice recorder. I raised an eyebrow. She nodded. Press play. I did. Elaine's voice came through, crisp and composed. We'll move the properties under Brittany's holding account first. That way, when the will is read, we can argue it was already in progress. Harold's on board. He's just nervous. Then silence. Then a chuckle. Vivian won't challenge it. She left. That was her choice. I stopped the tape. The words echoed longer than they should have. I didn't say anything for a long time. Sylvia didn't push. She never did. She just sipped her coffee like a woman who'd already lived through the answer I hadn't found yet. The recorder sat between us on the table, small, harmless looking, but now heavier than anything in my purse. I picked up the contract again, ran my fingers over the edge. The paper was still warm from the printer. They're doing this so smoothly, I said, like it's all just business. It is, she said, but so is stealing, so is betrayal. They just do it in heels and good lighting. I let out a breath, the kind that empties your ribs, but not your chest. Tell me I'm not just trying to get back at them. Sylvia leaned forward, her eyes locked with mine. You want the truth? Always. She smiled, soft, not sweet. You are trying to get back at them, but not because they hurt you, because they lied about who you were to your father and about who he was to you. I looked away. The magnolia tree outside the window was in bloom. My mother used to say those flowers only opened when they were ready. I keep wondering, I said, if I'm doing this for justice, or just to win. She tilted her head. Why do you think those are different things? That caught me, right in the gut. Because deep down, I knew what she meant. That winning wasn't petty if what was at stake was legacy. And that silence, no matter how noble, wouldn't preserve what my father trusted me to protect. I reached into my bag and pulled out my notebook, opened to the page I'd marked 3 nights ago, the one that listed every asset under the Calder Revocable Trust. I added a new line under the margin. Elaine, active manipulation. Brittany, attempted pre-sale. Harold, compromised. Then I drew a line under it all, a heavy one, because this wasn't just about what they did. It was about what I was willing to do next. And what that would say about me. Sylvia walked me back to the parking lot. She didn't ask what I'd decided, didn't offer more advice, just reached out and squeezed my hand before turning toward her car. You don't have to yell to be heard, she said, especially when you're the one holding the proof. The door shut with a quiet click, and she was gone. I sat in my own car for a long time, engine off, windows cracked, the smell of salt air drifting in from the harbor. The recorder sat in the passenger seat, the folder in my lap, the letter from my father tucked neatly in the glove compartment. I had the map, the motive, the means. But still I hesitated, not from fear, but from something more complicated, the knowledge that once I moved there'd be no undoing it, no polite conversations, no middle ground. They would come for me, with words, with lawyers, with history rewritten by the ones who stayed behind. And yet, the truth was mine now. And it was solid, filed, dated, signed. Not just a feeling, not a grudge, not a revenge fantasy, whispered over wine. This was legal. It was living. It was legacy. I started the engine, turned toward the road, and didn't look back. Franklin Hayes looked exactly the same, pressed suit, wire-frame glasses, still drank his coffee from the same tarnished silver cup he kept on the corner of his desk. The office hadn't changed much either. Framed certificates, a dusty bookshelf with legal volumes that hadn't been opened in years. The scent of old paper and wood polish clung to the room like memory. He gestured for me to sit. No small talk. I handed him the trust folder, said nothing as he opened it. Watched as his eyes moved across the documents 1 page at a time. His brow furrowed. He reached for a yellow legal pad, started jotting notes. His pen scratched across the page in sharp, straight lines. After a few minutes, he spoke. Well, he said finally, this changes everything. He held up the top page. The title clear, Calder Revocable Trust. Dated, signed, witnessed. Filed through his firm 3 years prior. I notarized this myself, he said, his voice quiet. I remember now. He didn't want Harold involved. Said he needed someone outside the family structure. Franklin turned the page, pulled out another sheet, the property transfer for Rivergreen. He held it up to the light. See this? He pointed to a small smudge in the corner. Richard's thumbprint, he said. His hands were always stained with ink after reviewing building plans. He never noticed. I stared at it. Not a signature, not a seal, just skin, evidence. Proof that he'd touched this paper physically, personally, that he'd left a mark that couldn't be rewritten. Franklin set it down gently, folded his hands. She's trying to sell these, he asked. She's already in talks, I said. Rivergreen is set to close in less than 3 weeks. He exhaled, leaned back, took a slow sip of his coffee. She's selling what she doesn't own. This trust trumps the will, trumps any intent to transfer title posthumously. Elaine doesn't just look bad, she looks fraudulent. My heart didn't race, it just settled deeper. Because now I knew, this wasn't a maybe. It wasn't a grudge or a guess. It was mine, all of it. Franklin slid the trust folder back toward me, but his fingers lingered on the edge like he didn't want to let go of it. Are you ready to go public with this? He asked. I stared at the folder, thick, heavy, quiet. I don't know if it's the right time, I said. It's never the right time, he replied. There's just time, and there's what you do with it. I looked down at the page on top. The ink had faded slightly where my father's signature sat, but it was still bold, still certain. I remembered the last fight we had, the one that ended with me walking out and Elaine standing behind him like a shadow in pearls. I thought he'd chosen her, but he hadn't. He just needed time, and now time had run out. My chest felt tight, but not from fear, from clarity, from the weight of being the only one who knew the truth and could prove it. Elaine wasn't just trying to sell River Green, she was trying to sell our name. My father's vision, everything he believed in about legacy, purpose, and land that wasn't just profit. And she was doing it with confidence, because she thought I'd stayed gone too long. That silence meant surrender. But silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's just the inhale before impact. Franklin pulled out a smaller envelope from his drawer. Richard gave this to me a few weeks before he died, he said. Told me to give it to you if you ever walked back in. I opened it, a single note in my father's handwriting. You already have everything you need. Just remember, they talk loud when they're scared. You never had to. I closed my eyes for a second, tasted the bitterness of the coffee still on the air, thought about Elaine standing at the front of the church accepting condolences like she'd lost something real, when what she'd lost was power and didn't even know it yet. I stood, gathered the documents, slipped the envelope into my coat pocket. I'll attend the will reading, I said, and I won't be alone. Franklin nodded. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't need to, because now everything was in motion. The next morning, I stood in my kitchen back in Atlanta. The light hit the countertop just right, warming the edge of the marble. Steam rose from my coffee, not the kind Elaine drank from a capsule. Mine was brewed slow French press dark roast, like my father used to make on Sunday mornings. I laid everything out on the table, the trust agreement, the property transfer records, Franklin's notarized note, my father's letter, each document layered with intention, each one impossible to dispute. I added one more thing, a manila folder with a printed transcript of the recording Sylvia had given me. Elaine's voice, smooth and sure Vivian won't challenge it. She left. I hadn't. I was back, and now I wasn't just returning. I was correcting. I booked my return to Charleston that afternoon, arranged a meeting with Franklin the morning of the will reading. He would be sitting with me, beside me. Not because I needed protection, but because I wanted witnesses. Let them see that my father had a plan. Let them realize too late that the person they tried to write out was already holding the pen. The evening before the reading, I went to the garden behind my Airbnb. Nothing elaborate, just a small patch of rosemary and wild mint. I crushed a leaf between my fingers. It reminded me of home, not the house Elaine curated, but the one my father built from values that couldn't be appraised. I didn't feel anger, not even vengeance. What I felt was readiness. I packed carefully. The navy suit, the one my father always said made me look like I owned the building. Low heels, no jewelry except the small silver pin my mother used to wear on city council days. At the bottom of my leather briefcase, the key to his study. Still warm from my hand. Still mine. I zipped it shut, and for the first time in weeks, slept straight through the night. The conference room on the top floor of Stevenson and Clark was colder than I remembered. Not in temperature, though the AC was humming high, but in design. Polished walnut table, heavy leather chairs, too much glass, not enough warmth. Elaine sat at the head of the table, black dress, high collar, hair perfectly pinned back. She looked like grief printed in a luxury catalog. Brittany was beside her, Miles slouched at the end, phone in hand, already bored. Harold sat to the right, flipping through papers like he was stalling for time. When I entered, all conversation stopped. Elaine didn't flinch, but her hand tightened around her coffee cup just enough for me to notice. "I wasn't informed you'd be joining," Harold said carefully. "I didn't need an invitation," I said, placing my briefcase on the table. "I'm not here to ask permission." No one replied, so I pulled out the folder, brown leather, no label. I placed it in front of me without opening it. "Let it sit there. Let them wonder." Elaine cleared her throat. "Let's begin." Harold adjusted his glasses and started reading. The legal preamble went on longer than it needed to. Standard language, estate summary, disposition of minor assets, donations, keepsakes, to Elaine the family residence, its furnishings, and 2 primary accounts. To Brittany and Miles, a trust of equal parts pending sale of non-essential holdings. Elaine's smile returned, for a moment, until Harold paused, then frowned. "There's an addendum," he said. He shuffled pages again, then blinked at one near the bottom of the stack. "It states that pending validation, all properties held within the Calder Revocable Trust are to remain under the existing trust structure, with Vivian Calder as sole trustee and legal beneficiary." Silence, immediate and total. Then Elaine's voice, sharp and cracking. "This isn't legal." Harold looked up, paled slightly. "I wasn't aware of this filing." "You wouldn't be," I said. "It wasn't filed through your office." Elaine turned to me, voice shaking with forced composure. "You left. You abandoned this family. That trust is a forgery." I opened the folder, laid out the originals, paper by paper, transfer deeds, notarizations, the stamped confirmation from Franklin's firm. I didn't say a word. The document said everything. Elaine didn't look at the papers. She stared at me instead, eyes narrow, lips trembling beneath lipstick that was one shade too bright for morning. "This is a stunt," she said. "A manipulation. Richard wouldn't have—" "He did," I said quietly, "and 3 years ago, no less." Harold picked up one of the deeds, turned it over, held it to the light like he was hoping it would disappear. "This is notarized by Franklin Hayes," he mumbled. "The trust predates the current will." Elaine leaned forward. Her tone dipped into something tighter. "What exactly are you claiming?" I met her eyes. "Not a claim, a confirmation. The Calder Trust holds Rivergreen, downtown retail, Whitmore Commons, everything you've been trying to list for sale." Brittany's expression changed first. She blinked, then looked toward Harold. "You said the company assets would be part of the estate," she said. "You told us we could move forward." Harold didn't answer. He was too busy reading line 5 of the trust summary again, the one where my father's signature sat next to mine. The ink slightly smudged, a fingerprint pressed into the corner. Elaine pushed back from the table. The chair's wheels made a sound too loud for the silence. "He was confused," she said. "Near the end. He didn't understand what he was doing." I reached into my folder one last time, pulled out the letter, set it gently in the center of the table. "He understood perfectly," I said. "He just didn't tell you, because he knew what you'd do." Her hand twitched, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't have to. The others were already reading. "This isn't revenge," I said. No one asked the question, but I needed to say it, for myself. This is legacy. My father didn't want this company to be stripped for parts. He wanted it to last. For the people who built it with him, not the ones who came after with polished shoes and sharper knives. Elaine's face drained of color. Miles stood up, muttering something under his breath. Brittany looked like someone had cracked the glass in front of her. Not shattered, it just fractured it enough that now she couldn't look away. I sat back in my chair, not triumphant, not gloating. Just steady. I wasn't taking anything. I was protecting what was already mine, and they knew it. Elaine didn't speak again. Not after Harold confirmed the legality, not after Franklin arrived uninvited, but fully prepared, carrying the duplicate trust binder and a calm, lethal presence. She just sat there frozen in her chair, palms flat on the table like she was bracing for impact. Brittany flipped through the documents. Her fingers moved faster than her brain. She wasn't reading, she was searching for a loophole, a mistake, an escape hatch that didn't exist. "This was supposed to be ours," she whispered. "We worked on those listings for months." Franklin leaned over. "Then you'll understand how devastating it would have been for your investors if this had gone through without proper ownership." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Elaine pushed her chair back. It scraped sharply against the floor. "This isn't over," she said. "Not to anyone in particular, not even to me." More like a line she was reciting to convince herself. I stayed seated. "You're right," I said. "It's not. The properties remain under the Calder Trust. All offers and transactions moving forward will go through my office, effective immediately." Miles scoffed. "You think people are just going to fall in line?" I turned to him level. "I don't need them to fall in line. I need them to know who's holding the deed." He looked away. Franklin began collecting the papers. Harold stayed seated, eyes low, as if staring hard enough at his notes would rewrite the day. Elaine paused in the doorway. She looked smaller somehow, not defeated but exposed. A woman who had built her entire identity around access, and just discovered the door was never really hers to open. I didn't offer her a parting word, no final jab, no clever send-off. Because silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it's a verdict, and mine had already been delivered. Franklin held the door for me. "Vivian," he said quietly. "What would Richard say if he were here?" I smiled, not because it felt good, but because I finally understood. He'd say, "Nice move. Now finish what we started." Elaine stood up so fast her chair toppled behind her. The room jerked to silence. Only the hum of the overhead lights remained. "I will sue," she said, her voice sharp, final, hands trembling but still trying to look regal. "This trust, this ambush, this performance, it's manipulation. And you—" She pointed at me like I was a trespasser in her kingdom. "You will not get away with this." Harold didn't lift his head. He knew. And so did Franklin, seated calmly beside me, hands folded over his lap, like we were still reviewing paperwork. Elaine turned to him, desperate now. "Say something. You've known Richard for decades. He wouldn't do this to me." Franklin cleared his throat. "He didn't do anything to you," he said. "He did something for Vivian. There's a difference." Brittany let out a breath sharp enough to cut the air. She stood, adjusted her blouse, and pushed her chair in with delicate precision. "I'm not going down with this," she muttered. "I have my own business to protect." Elaine looked stunned. "Miles," she hissed, turning to him, "say something." But Miles had already gathered his things. He tossed his messenger bag over his shoulder, shook his head, and walked toward the door. "No one ever told me anything anyway," he said, half to the room, half to himself. This place was never mine. The door slammed behind him. Elaine stayed frozen, and I stood. Not angry, not vindicated, just ready. I walked slowly to the front of the room, pressed a button on the remote in my hand. The screen on the wall lit up. A video, simple, clear. My father sat in a leather chair, no suit, no script, just a glass of water beside him, and his voice steady, if a little worn. "If you're watching this, it means I've passed, and that my daughter Vivian is sitting where I once stood. I want her to know nothing about this was accidental." Elaine moved as if to interrupt, but Franklin raised a hand. "Let it finish," he said. I did too. On screen, my father looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his voice still carried the same conviction he used to reserve for foundation meetings and late-night kitchen talks. "Vivian, I know things between us haven't been easy. I let pride get in the way. I let Elaine get between us longer than I should have. That's on me." He paused, took a sip of water, glanced away like he was thinking of a version of me he hadn't seen in too long. But I watched. Even when we weren't speaking, I watched. Your firm in Atlanta, your plans, the way you talked about space like it was a form of respect. My chest tightened. You never tried to make things look expensive. You tried to make them feel like home. That's why River Green is yours. Elaine flinched. Not in some sentimental way, he continued, but because you understood what it was supposed to be. A living community. Mixed income housing. Local vendors. Public gardens. Not luxury condos and gated boutiques. I knew Brittany and Miles wouldn't get it. I knew Elaine wouldn't try. So I moved the properties quietly. Not out of spite, but because I finally realized something. He leaned closer to the camera. Protecting a vision is harder than building it. And you, Vivian, you protect things even when no one's watching. The screen faded to black. No music, no signature, just the hum of the projector winding down. The room stayed still. Even Elaine had stopped breathing out loud. I reached down, pressed the button again, turned the screen off. Then looked at her. Her pearls seemed tighter against her throat, the lines on her face deeper. This was never a coup, I said. This was an inheritance of responsibility. She swallowed but said nothing. I could see it landing now, not just the legality, the message. This wasn't just about power, it was about purpose. The company, the land, River Green. None of it was designed to be sold. It was designed to last. Elaine reached for her purse like she needed something to hold, or maybe just something to shield her from the weight of being wrong. I gave that man 20 years, she whispered, more to herself than to any of us. 20 years of my life. I looked at her, really looked. Not as the woman who'd tried to erase me, but as the woman who'd spent 2 decades mistaking proximity for power. You were his wife, I said, and he left you the home, the accounts, the memories. She raised her eyes to mine hollow now, but not the name. I didn't respond. Because there are some losses no inheritance can fix. Brittany had already stepped away from the table. She stood by the window, arms crossed back to everyone, her reflection staring back at her, unmoving, unreadable. She hadn't said a word since the video ended, and she didn't now. Maybe she was replaying all the meetings, the paperwork, the investor calls she had made, thinking she was the heir to something solid, not knowing the foundation had been moved out from under her 3 years ago. Miles didn't come back. He wouldn't. Franklin gathered the remaining documents. Harold stood slowly, every movement stiff with discomfort. I believe that concludes the reading, he said. But it didn't, not really. The reading was just formality, the fallout that was the story. Because it wasn't just assets that had been reassigned. It was the truth, ownership, narrative, legacy. Oh. I walked to the head of the table, not to claim it, just to clear it. I slid the folder back into my briefcase, closed it gently. This isn't about keeping something from you, I said, my voice even. It's about keeping a promise to someone who saw what you never could. Elaine didn't reply, didn't argue. She just lowered her eyes to her lap. A queen dethroned not by force, but by paper, by time, by a daughter who had learned not to scream, but to wait. As I left the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt done. Done with proving, done with asking, done with watching them define a future that was never meant to be theirs. I had work to do, land to protect, people to build with. My father gave me the final word. And I didn't waste it. Would you still call it revenge if all you did was keep your promise? The ribbon was soft in my hand. Blue, not corporate blue, no branding, no logo, just the color of still water, of silence, calm, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout. I handed the scissors to a little girl in a floral dress. Her mother stood nearby, one hand on her shoulder, the other wiping at her eyes. A single mother. First tenant. former waitress turned manager of the River Green Community Garden. The girl hesitated, then cut. The ribbon fluttered to the ground like a sigh released. Applause followed, soft and real, not staged, not obligatory, just people clapping because they believed in what this place meant now. River Green Commons was open, not a condo, not a luxury build, a real place for real people. Mixed income housing, a rooftop library, a courtyard with benches under the trees, a women's resource center in the south wing named after my mother. The tile mosaic at the entrance had been made by local artists. It read, "This place was built on purpose." I walked through the main hall. Children's voices echoed from the playground outside. The scent of rosemary and fresh paint still clung to the air. Midway down the hall, framed behind glass, my father's letter, the one he wrote to me, the one that changed everything. I had it sealed, protected, lit by soft lighting next to a plaque that simply read, "Richard L. Whitmore, founder, Vivian Calder, architect." No fanfare, no photograph, just words, the kind that lasted longer than applause ever could. Elaine left Charleston quietly. No farewell party, no newspaper announcement, just a moving truck one Thursday morning and a note left with her attorney confirming the sale of her remaining shares in the Whitmore Holdings. The house on East Bay went on the market a week later, renovated again, this time with granite countertops and staged furniture. Even the rose bushes were replaced with boxwoods, neat, predictable, forgettable. The rumor was she'd gone to Connecticut near her sister, a gated community, tennis courts, private garden club. She sent no letter, made no call, and I never asked. Brittany vanished more dramatically. 1 week after River Green's opening, her company filed for reorganization. 2 developers pulled out. 1 investor sued. Someone had leaked internal emails, nothing illegal, but enough to show intent. She posted a long message on LinkedIn about navigating betrayal in business and emerging stronger through setbacks. It was polished, branded, hollow. She didn't mention me. She didn't need to. Everyone in Charleston knew. Our paths never crossed again. People kept asking if I planned to respond, to make a statement, to clear the air, but I didn't. Because some stories are finished when the work speaks louder than the wound. I never raised my voice, never published an op-ed, never sat down for a glossy profile about how I reclaimed what was mine. Instead, I built what came next, brick by brick, meeting by meeting, quietly. At the community center, we started hosting weekly workshops for women over 40. Those pushed out of family businesses, inheritances, legacies, they helped shape but were never allowed to own. The first session had 6 women, the second had 20. By the third, we had to move it to the courtyard. One woman whispered to me. They said my name didn't belong on the deed, but now I know I didn't need their permission to matter. I didn't say anything, just smiled, because that was it. That was the legacy. Some nights, I still sit on the rooftop garden of River Green. There's a bench facing the west end overlooking the marshes, where the sun pulls gold out of the water just before it sets. That view is in the original site plan my father drew. He wanted people to see something wide before they went to sleep. Said it gave the soul more room to rest. I think he was right. I come here without ceremony, no clipboard, no agenda. Just quiet. A few of the residents nod as they pass. Some don't know who I am, others know but never mention it. I don't need them to. What we built here wasn't about credit. It was about correction. For every woman who sat through estate meetings and was called emotional. For every daughter cut out of a legacy she helped shape. For every silence mistaken for weakness. I didn't come back to burn things down. I came back to finish what was started. People still ask me, was it revenge? I say no. Revenge is loud, temporary. It leaves ashes. This was different. This was permanence, a recalibration, not to destroy, but to restore. And the restoration is still ongoing. The plaque outside the main hall bears only one quote: "Justice doesn't need applause, it needs memory." Beneath it, no names, because real justice isn't personal. It's purposeful. I keep my father's pen in the top drawer of my desk. It doesn't work anymore, but I still hold it sometimes. It reminds me that some signatures don't fade, not when they're written on the right lines for the right reasons. I never spoke to Elaine again, not once, never needed to, because the house she tried to sell is now a public library, because the land she wanted to liquidate holds a preschool and a farmer's market, because the people she thought were beneath her name now know mine, and not because I shouted it, but because I stayed. If your name had been erased once, would you ever let it happen again? Let your story speak, and subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for the ones who reclaimed everything, without raising their voice.